Arrival at Thornfield House. The carriage wheels ground softly against the gravel as Eliza Hartwell stepped down into the quiet shadow of Thornfield House, her gloved hand lingering on the doorframe a moment longer than necessary. The estate loomed before her, vast, aged stones softened by creeping ivy, its tall windows reflecting a pale, indifferent sky. It was not ruinous, not neglected, but it carried a stillness that felt deliberate, as though the house itself had chosen silence over life. She adjusted the strap of her modest travel bag and took in a slow breath. This was not her first position as a caretaker, but something about the place unsettled her. Not fear exactly, but a sense of being watched by something unseen, something that measured rather than welcomed. The front doors opened before she could knock. Thomas Blackwood stood framed in the entryway, tall and composed, his presence as rigid as the estate itself. His dark coat was immaculate, his posture controlled to the point of severity. His gaze moved over Eliza quickly, assessing, calculating, and then settling into something faintly approving. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his tone even, neither warm nor cold. "You arrived on time." "I'll make it a habit, sir," Eliza replied softly. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The interior of Thornfield House was grand but restrained, polished wood floors, tall ceilings, and carefully arranged furnishings that seemed more preserved than used. No laughter echoed here, no sign of life beyond necessity. Even the air felt still, as though it had been instructed not to move too freely. "You have been informed of your duties," Thomas continued, leading her down a long corridor. His footsteps echoed faintly, each one precise. "My brother requires consistent care. Your role is to provide it. Nothing more." Eliza inclined her head. "I understand." Thomas paused briefly, his gaze sharpening as he turned to face her. "It is important that you do not mistake kindness for connection. My brother's condition can be misleading." The words lingered in the air, heavier than their simplicity suggested. "I am here to do my work," Eliza said, though she felt the weight of his warning settle somewhere deeper than she expected. Thomas studied her a moment longer before continuing. "You will find your accommodations prepared. You will begin tomorrow morning." As they moved further into the house, Eliza became aware of another presence, not through sound, but through absence. A door stood slightly ajar at the end of the hall, and from within came the faintest shift of movement, subtle enough to be imagined. "That is his wing," Thomas said without looking back. "You're not required to attend him tonight." Eliza did not respond, but her eyes lingered on the door for a fraction longer before she followed him onward. Later, as dusk settled over the estate, she found herself standing alone in her room, the quiet pressing in around her. The space was modest but comfortable, its simplicity almost a relief after the heavy grandeur of the rest of the house. She set her bag down carefully, smoothing the creases from her dress as though restoring order might steady her thoughts. A soft knock came at the door. When she opened it, she found a woman standing in the dim corridor light. Margaret Blackwood. There was no need for introduction. Her presence carried a quiet authority that required none. She was elegantly dressed, her posture effortless, her expression composed in a way that suggested long practice. Yet there was something distant in her gaze, something removed, as though her attention rested somewhere beyond the walls of the house. "Miss Hartwell," Margaret said gently, "I wish to greet you before the evening grew too late." Eliza inclined her head. "Mrs. Blackwood." Margaret's eyes softened, though not with warmth. "You have come for my husband." The statement was simple, but its meaning lingered. "Yes," Eliza replied carefully. Margaret stepped slightly closer, her voice lowering. "You will find him difficult to understand." "Many do." She paused, her gaze drifting briefly down the corridor toward the distant wing. "But difficulty is not always danger." Eliza met her eyes, sensing something unspoken beneath the words. "And is he dangerous?" Margaret's lips curved faintly, though there was no humor in it. "No," she said after a moment. "Only alone." The answer settled heavily between them. Margaret straightened, her composure returning as if nothing had shifted. "You should rest." Tomorrow will require your attention." With that, she turned and disappeared into the dim corridor, her footsteps fading into the same silence that filled the house. Eliza closed the door slowly, her thoughts no longer as steady as they had been upon arrival. Dangerous, Thomas had implied. Alone, Margaret had said. Two truths that did not quite align. Sleep did not come easily. The house seemed to breathe differently at night, its silence deeper, its shadows more deliberate. At some point, unable to rest, Eliza rose from her bed and moved quietly to the window. The ground stretched out into darkness, the faint outline of trees swaying against the horizon. And then, without meaning to, her gaze shifted toward the far wing. A single light burned behind one of the tall windows. It flickered, not wildly, not erratically, but with a subtle inconsistency, as though disturbed by movement within. Eliza hesitated. She could turn away. She could return to bed and wait for morning, as instructed. Instead, she found herself watching. The light dimmed briefly, then steadied again. A shadow passed across the window, tall, indistinct, but undeniably human. Not violent, not frantic, still, waiting. Eliza's breath slowed as something quiet and unexpected settled in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. Whatever lived behind that window was not what she had been warned to expect. And for reasons she could not yet name, she knew that tomorrow would not unfold as simply as it had been planned. She stepped back from the window at last, the image lingering in her mind as she returned to her bed. Beyond the walls of Thornfield House, the night stretched on in silence. But within it, something had already begun to shift. The quiet between them. Morning arrived at Thornfield House without ceremony. The light that filtered through the tall windows was pale and restrained, illuminating the corridors without warming them. Eliza Hartwell dressed in silence, her thoughts already fixed on the distant wing she had watched the night before. Whatever uncertainty she had carried with her upon arrival had sharpened into quiet resolve. She did not wait to be summoned. The hallway leading to Adrian Blackwood's quarters felt subtly different from the rest of the estate. The air was not colder, nor darker, yet something about it resisted ease. Eliza moved with measured steps, aware of the weight of Thomas Blackwood's warning and Margaret's softer contradiction. By the time she reached the door, she understood that both had told a version of the truth, but neither had told all of it. She knocked once. No answer came. After a brief pause, she pushed the door open. The room beyond was spacious but sparsely lived in, its furnishings arranged with care but untouched by comfort. A tall window admitted a wash of muted daylight, falling across the wooden floor in long, quiet lines. Near it stood a man. Adrian Blackwood did not turn at once. He remained still, his gaze fixed beyond the glass, as though the world outside demanded more of his attention than anything within. His posture was not tense, but neither was it relaxed. It carried a kind of stillness that suggested not peace, but endurance. "Good morning," Eliza said gently, closing the door behind her. Only then did he shift. His eyes moved toward her, not with alarm or confusion, but with a slow awareness, as though he had already sensed her presence and simply chosen not to acknowledge it. There was no wildness in his expression, no sign of the instability she had been cautioned about. Instead, there was something quieter, something worn. "You've come," he said. His voice was low, steady, and entirely lucid. Eliza inclined her head slightly. "I have come to assist you." A faint pause followed, as though he considered the phrasing. "They all come to observe," Adrian replied. "Assistance is rarely the purpose." Eliza did not flinch at the remark. "Then I will be the exception." For a moment, he simply looked at her. It was not an intense gaze, nor a suspicious one. It was searching in a way that felt unfamiliar, as though he were trying to place her within a framework that had failed him before. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted, if only slightly. "We will see." The distance between them remained, but it no longer felt impenetrable. Eliza moved further into the room, taking note of the details that others might have overlooked. Books lined one wall, their arrangement orderly, but untouched by recent use. A chair sat near the window, positioned not for comfort, but for observation. Everything in the room suggested presence without participation. "You spend your time here," she said, not as a question, but as acknowledgement. Adrian followed her glance briefly before returning his attention to her. "Time is not something I am permitted to spend elsewhere." There was no bitterness in the statement, only fact. Eliza felt the quiet weight of it settle between them. That must be difficult. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the window, his profile softened by the light. "Difficult implies resistance," he said after a moment. "This is expectation." The words carried a finality that left little room for argument. Eliza studied him carefully, noting the absence of agitation, the clarity of his speech, the control in his movements. Whatever madness had been assigned to him, it did not manifest in any way she could see. What she saw instead was isolation, carefully maintained, quietly endured. "You are not what they described," she said before she could reconsider. Adrian's gaze flickered back to her, sharper now, though not unkind. "No," he agreed. "I rarely am." The simplicity of the exchange unsettled her more than any display of instability could have. She moved to the small table near the center of the room, arranging the items she had brought with her: tea, a simple meal, necessities disguised as routine. The act grounded her, gave structure to a moment that threatened to drift into something less defined. "You should eat," she said. Adrian watched her for a moment longer before crossing the room. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though each step had been considered in advance. When he reached the table, he did not sit immediately. Instead, he looked at the arrangement, then at her. "You're not afraid," he observed. Eliza met his gaze. "Should I be?" A faint, almost imperceptible shift touched his expression, something that might have been surprise, or perhaps something closer to recognition. "They usually are," he said. Eliza considered that, then shook her head slightly. "Fear requires cause, and you have found none." "Not yet." The honesty of her response lingered in the space between them. Adrian sat then, the motion quiet, unguarded. He reached for the cup she had placed before him, his fingers brushing briefly against the porcelain before closing around it. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight Eliza could not fully name. For the first time since she had entered the room, the silence between them felt shared rather than imposed. She remained standing for a moment, watching him as he lifted the cup, as though confirming something for herself. There was no performance in his actions, no effort to conform to expectation. He simply existed within the space he had been given. And for reasons she did not yet understand, Eliza felt that space shift, subtly but undeniably. Not because of anything he had done, but because for the first time, someone had chosen to see him differently. Adrian set the cup down after a moment, his gaze returning to her with quiet intent. "You will not remain untouched by this place," he said. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was certainty. Eliza held his gaze, aware of the truth in his words, even as she chose not to retreat from them. "I did not come here to remain untouched," she replied. The answer settled between them, altering something neither of them could yet define. Inside, the distance between them had lessened, not erased, but changed in a way that could not be undone. And though neither spoke of it, both understood that something had begun, something quiet, something dangerous, and something neither of them would be able to ignore. The breaking point. The fragile balance Eliza Hartwell had maintained began to unravel with a quiet persistence she could neither halt nor deny. What had once been defined by duty, structured visits, careful words, measured distance, shifted into something less certain, more dangerous. Thornfield House remained unchanged in its silence, yet within its stillness, something had begun to move beyond restraint. Adrian Blackwood no longer waited by the window as he once had. He waited for her. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it altered everything. His attention, once fixed on a distant world, now settled on the space she occupied. When she entered the room, he acknowledged her not as an interruption, but as an expectation fulfilled. Eliza felt the shift immediately, though she did not speak of it. Instead, she continued her routine, placing a tray on the table, arranging it with quiet precision as though structure might contain what had begun to slip beyond control. "You stay longer," Adrian said, his voice low, steady. Eliza did not look at him immediately. "My duties require consistency, and more than consistency." His words lingered in the air, not demanding, but certain. She lifted her gaze then, meeting his eyes with a calm she did not fully feel. "You are improving. Because you remain," he replied. The simplicity of his response unsettled her more than any accusation could have. It carried truth without defense, recognition without hesitation. Eliza turned slightly, creating distance where none had existed before. "That is not reason enough." Adrian rose slowly, his movements deliberate, unhurried. "It appears to be." The narrowing space between them felt inevitable, though neither had yet chosen to acknowledge it. Eliza remained still, aware of the quiet tension building, pressing against the boundaries she had so carefully upheld. "You misunderstand your position," she said, though the words lacked the firmness they required. "And you misunderstand yours," Adrian answered. The reply struck deeper than she expected, not because it was harsh, but because it was precise. Eliza drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the pull she could no longer ignore. "I am here to care for you," she said. "And I am no longer what they claim me to be," he returned. The truth of it hung between them, undeniable. Eliza had seen it from the beginning. The absence of madness, the presence of something quieter, more human. Yet acknowledging it now felt like crossing a threshold she could not easily retreat from. Silence followed, but it was no longer neutral. It carried awareness, tension, something unspoken that demanded recognition. "You are married," she said at last, grounding herself in fact. Adrian's gaze did not waver. "Yes, and that should matter." "It does," he said. To them, the distinction was subtle, but it altered everything. Eliza felt it settle within her, unsettling the clarity she had relied upon. "It should matter to you." Adrian regarded her quietly, something deeper surfacing beneath his composed exterior. "It once did." The weight of the admission left little room for argument. Outside, the sky darkened without warning. Rain began to fall against the tall windows, its steady rhythm filling the room with a low, persistent sound. The shift in atmosphere felt abrupt, yet fitting, as though the world beyond had aligned itself with what neither of them had resolved. "I should go," Eliza said, though she did not move. Adrian stepped closer. "You say that," he replied, "but you do not act on it." The observation was calm, but it carried a truth she could not deny. Eliza held his gaze, aware of the narrowing distance of the moment drawing inward, leaving little room for retreat. "I'm trying to do what is right," she said quietly. Adrian's expression did not harden, nor did it soften. It remained steady, certain. "Then why does it feel like resistance?" The question unsettled her more than any declaration could have. It did not challenge her actions, it challenged her understanding of them. She did not answer. Instead, she remained where she was, her stillness speaking what words could not. Adrian's hand lifted, the movement slow, deliberate, leaving space for refusal. Eliza did not step back. The contact, when it came, was light, barely more than the brush of fingers. It carried a weight that made everything else irrelevant. The boundary that had once existed between them blurred in that single moment, its clarity dissolving into something far less certain. It should have ended there. It did not. Eliza's silence became permission. What followed was not sudden, nor driven by impulse, but by recognition of what had been building, of what had already taken root long before either had chosen to name it. The storm outside intensified, its presence pressing against the walls, while within, the quiet between them deepened into something undeniable. When it passed, the silence it left behind was altered. Not empty, irreversible. Eliza stepped back first, the motion small but decisive. The distance returned, but it no longer protected. It defined what had been lost. "This cannot continue," she said, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. Adrian did not argue. No, the agreement offered no comfort. Eliza turned toward the door, her composure intact, though the certainty that had once guided her had begun to fracture. Each step felt deliberate, necessary, yet incomplete. At the threshold, she paused, not to reconsider, but to understand. Nothing within Thornfield House would remain untouched by what had occurred, and neither would she. Without looking back, she left the room. Behind her, the storm began to fade, its echo lingering in the silence. But what it had revealed remained, unspoken, unavoidable, and no longer contained. The cost of understanding. Morning did not soften what the night had made certain. Thornfield House stood unchanged in its stillness, yet something within had shifted beyond concealment. Eliza Hartwell moved through its corridors with measured composure, her steps quiet, her posture controlled. Outwardly, nothing betrayed her, but inwardly, every certainty she had relied upon had begun to fracture. She did not delay. When she reached Adrian Blackwood's door, she paused only long enough to steady her breath before entering. The room greeted her as it always had, orderly, restrained, untouched by comfort. Yet the familiarity no longer reassured her. It reminded her. Adrian stood near the window, though he was not looking beyond it. His attention turned to her immediately, as though her presence had already been anticipated. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no confusion, only recognition. "You returned," he said. His voice was calm, but the words carried weight. Eliza met his eyes, holding his gaze with quiet resolve. Leaving would not have undone anything. "No," Adrian replied. "It would not." The truth of it settled between them, steady and immovable. Eliza stepped further into the room, though her movements were more deliberate than before. The space between them felt altered, not diminished, but defined by what had already passed. "This cannot continue," she said. Adrian did not look away. "It already has." The quiet certainty in his voice left no room for denial. Eliza exhaled slowly, gathering what remained of her restraint. "There are consequences," she said. "For you, for me, for them," Adrian added, though his tone carried distance rather than concern. Eliza's gaze lowered briefly before returning to his. "They will not ignore this." Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not into anger, but into something quieter, more resolved. "They have ignored worse." The words lingered, heavy with implication. Before Eliza could respond, the moment fractured. A knock sounded at the door, measured, deliberate, impossible to dismiss. Neither of them moved at first. The knock came again. Adrian's gaze remained on Eliza for a brief moment longer before he spoke. "Come in." The door opened. Margaret Blackwood entered with the same composed grace she carried in every aspect of her presence. Her posture was effortless, her expression controlled, yet her eyes were attentive, taking in the distance between them, the subtle shift in the air, the absence of neutrality that could no longer be concealed. She closed the door behind her. Silence followed, but it was no longer uncertain. It was precise. "I wondered when clarity would arrive," Margaret said softly. Her gaze moved from Adrian to Eliza, not accusatory but certain. Eliza felt the weight of it settle against her, though she did not look away. Adrian remained still. "You presume too much." Margaret inclined her head slightly. "No," she said. "I observe enough." The calmness in her voice unsettled more than anger could have. Eliza drew a breath, aware that silence would serve no purpose now. This was not. Margaret lifted her hand gently, halting her before the words could form. "There is little value in explanation," she said. "Truth rarely survives it." The statement carried neither cruelty nor comfort, only precision. Margaret turned her attention fully to Adrian. "You were never what they called you," she said. "Only what they allowed you to become." The words struck with quiet force. Adrian's gaze held hers, though he did not respond. Margaret continued, her composure unwavering. "And now you have found something that feels like understanding." Her eyes shifted briefly to Eliza. It is unfortunate that it arrives through betrayal. Eliza felt the truth of it settle deeply, leaving no space for defense. "This is not hers alone," Adrian said, his voice steady. Margaret's expression did not change. "No," she agreed. "It never is." Silence followed, but this time it carried conclusion. Margaret stepped back slightly, her posture unchanged. "You will leave," she said, her gaze returning to Eliza. The words were quiet, but they held finality. Eliza did not resist them. Somewhere within her, the decision had already taken shape. Margaret had merely spoken it aloud. "Yes," she said. Adrian's gaze shifted toward her, something unspoken passing through it. "You do not have to." "I do," Eliza replied, her voice steady. "Not because they ask it, because it is the only way this ends without destroying what remains." The truth of her words settled heavily between them. Adrian did not argue. Margaret watched them both for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. "It will be arranged," she said, before leaving as quietly as she had entered. The room fell still once more. Eliza remained where she stood for a moment, then moved to gather her things. The space around her felt altered, not unfamiliar, but no longer hers to occupy. When she turned back, Adrian had not moved. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, everything that had passed between them remained real, undeniable, but no longer possible. "You were not alone," Eliza said softly. Adrian held her gaze. "Neither were you." It was not comfort, but it was truth. Eliza inclined her head slightly, then turned toward the door. This time, she did not pause. As she stepped into the corridor, the weight of Thornfield House settled into something permanent. Not oppressive, but unyielding. Behind her, Adrian remained where she had left him. Not unchanged, but no longer unseen. And as Eliza walked away, she understood that some connections did not end. They remained, shaped by memory, defined by absence. Outside, the light had returned, pale but steady. Yet within it lingered a question that would not easily fade. What becomes of truth when it arrives too late to be lived?